A win for the White House. The U.S. travel ban on a handful of Muslim-majority countries can stand. The top court says it's not discrimination, while a dissenting judge calls it misguided and anti-Muslim.
Other countries are negotiating, and without tariffs, you could never do that.
The U.S. president not backing down from trade tensions and revving up against the rhetoric against an all-American company that's on the move.
Live from Washington, this is The World Today.
Hello and thanks for joining us. I'm Roee Ruttenberg in Washington, D.C. The U.S. Supreme Court has upheld President Donald Trump's controversial travel ban. It affects several Muslim-majority countries. In a 5-4 decision, the High Court did not agree that the policy discriminated against Muslims. CGTN's Jim Spellman is in the newsroom with a reaction. Jim, Trump celebrating a huge legal win.
A huge win for the White House and one a long time coming. Remember that President Trump ran for office making this promise.
Donald J. Trump is calling for a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States.
The courts allowed the ban to go into effect while the case was under consideration, so not much will change at U.S. borders because of Tuesday's ruling, Roy.
Jim, I know there's been some protests already on Tuesday outside of the Supreme Court. How have opponents of the travel ban been reacting?
Well, opponents of this ban say the ruling may lead to further discrimination against religious minorities. Opponents of the president say this travel ban and Trump administration policies that have separated families along the U.S. border with Mexico are solidifying resistance to Trump and his Republican Party. They hope that will translate into victories in the upcoming midterm congressional elections, Roy.
Thank you, Jim Spellman, in the newsroom for us. Joining me from New York on this story is Rawaida Abdel-Aziz. She's a reporter at the Huffington Post. She's focusing on Islamophobia and the Muslim community. Rawaida, thank you for joining us. First, what's your reaction, if I can ask you, to this ruling?
The reaction to this ruling, to me as a journalist, honestly, was quite shocking. And I think many of the folks in the Muslim community have told me that as well, that they themselves are shocked. They're disappointed. They're feeling a mixture of emotions. It's quite a difficult time. They're still processing, and I don't think many of them expected for the Supreme Court to uphold the travel ban, granted what has happened in the lower courts over the past few months.
The Trump administration's position has been that there are dozens of Muslim-majority countries that aren't on this list. Therefore, they say it's not really a Muslim ban. Do you buy that?
Well, folks in the Muslim communities certainly don't. And as a reporter has been covering these communities for quite some time, I can tell you for a fact that they don't buy that. And there are a number of reasons as to why they don't buy that. We have to look at the overall context. When looking at President Donald Trump, when he was a candidate and running, saying, quotes, that he was looking for a complete and total shutdown of Muslims entering a country. In another instance, saying that Islam hates us. And that, coupled with the rising Islamophobia that's happening in this country, over 67% of hate crimes have risen in the U.S., the Muslim community certainly doesn't believe that their race and their ethnicity certainly doesn't really play a role when it comes to the travel ban.
We've been seeing a lot of the protests since that travel ban was introduced. There was quite a vocal movement against the ban. Where does that movement turn now? Where does it go?
Well, folks in the Muslim community and local human rights organizations and activists are not standing down. Many of them have continued to say that they will fight and appeal this ban. Lawyers and legal representations are making their way to the airport, as we saw with the first ban, when there was chaos at the airports, with folks attempting to enter the country and just mass confusion, to be quite honest. And so organizations like the ACLU, organizations like CARE, the Council of American Islamic Relations, don't take this decision lightly and say that they have a lot more work in front of them and are prepared to put up a fight.
As we heard from our reporter earlier, Jim Spellman, he was saying that the impact won't be immediately felt because the court allowed the policy to already be implemented while it was awaiting its decision. But still, how do you think this ruling, a 5-4 ruling, will be viewed overseas, and specifically by Muslims overseas?
Muslims overseas have been extremely wary of this administration since the very beginning. Unfortunately, both Muslims in this country and overseas don't have the best relationship with this administration. In addition to stereotyping and making generalizing comments about the Muslim community in Islam, people are weary They're afraid and they're quite concerned, especially when we look at countries like Syria and Yemen, where the U.S. has an active hand in its foreign policy in, quite honestly, creating the refugee crisis happening in both those countries. And for them to seek stability and safety and to try to enter the U.S. to find a new life and to start over, to only be denied, is causing quite a rift overseas. And both here, families who are of Syrian and Yemeni descent, who have family members that they were trying to bring and for them to be safe and stable for once in a very long time. So I can't say that the attitude is positive.
Ruwaida Abdelaziz, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us on this topic, of course, that we've been following very closely. U.S. President Donald Trump still fuming over Harley-Davidson's decision to shift some motorcycle production overseas. Trump denies his trade policy is to blame. On Tuesday, he took to Twitter to attack the American company. He said Harley-Davidson should never be built in another country, never. Their employees and customers are already very angry at them. If they move, watch. It'll be the beginning of the end. Trump threatened Harley will be, quote, taxed like never before if the motorcycle maker expands overseas productions. Harley says it could lose up to $100 million every year from new EU taxes on bikes shipped from the U.S. Last week, the European Union raised its tariffs from 6% to 31% in response to U.S. duties on metal imports. The fortunes of American distillers may be about to change. Production of craft whiskey and other spirits have been booming in the United States, thanks in part to Europe's growing taste for them. But as Owen Fairclough reports, those products have been suddenly caught in the crossfire of a global trade conflict.
See if I can fill that last one up.
From a trickle to a lucrative stream.
China has announced it will lower tariffs on imports from some Asian Pacific countries starting on July 1st. The list of over 8,000 items includes chemicals, agricultural goods, steel, and medical products. A 3% tariff on soybeans was imported from India, South Korea, and Asian trade partners will also be removed. Still to come, time running out for teens trapped inside a cave in Thailand. We'll have more on the desperate search. And a new front in space. What would a U.S. Space Force look like, and what would it do? In Thailand, 12 boys and their football coach remain lost, cut off in a deep cave. Authorities have launched a huge search and rescue mission, but heavy rain is hindering their progress. CGTN's Tony Cheng reports on the fading hope for the missing.
The long and tortuous wait for the parents and relatives of the 12 boys trapped inside the cave.
U.S. Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis has arrived in Beijing for a 3-day visit. It's Mattis's first time in China as Pentagon chief. He says he's focused on denuclearizing the Korean Peninsula, but says he will go into talks with Chinese officials with no preconceived notions. China says it greatly values so-called mill-to-mill cooperation.
Military exchanges between China and the United States have been a vital part of bilateral ties. It's a fact known to all that steady progress has been made in exchanges between the two militaries.
Last month, the U.S. withdrew an invitation to China to join a biannual multinational naval exercise held in the Pacific. After this visit, Mattis heads to South Korea and Japan. The New Space Conference in the U.S. is exploring the role the military could play in outer space. A panel of high-ranking U.S. military officials will discuss the future mission of the armed forces in space. Last week, U.S. President Donald Trump announced his plan to begin an American Space Force. If created, it would become the 6th branch of the U.S. military, according to Trump. The conference also focuses on ways of expanding the commercial space industry. I'm joined now by Keith Cowan. He's the editor of NASAWatch.com. He's also an astrobiologist and a former rocket scientist. Keith, what would that Space Force look like?
Well, you know, President Trump likes to say Space Force, and a lot of the folks who might be called to implement that are sort of scratching their heads. It means different things to different people. In a grand sense, it means pretty much how we deal with the threat of military weapons in space, and there are many countries who have those things up there. And a lot of people would say, well, we're already doing that. Why do we need something with a new name and a new zip code and a new telephone number? Some other people say, well, maybe this is a bigger thing, that maybe we're going to expand beyond what is being done. And again, these conferences are sort of working it out. And of course, if you watch enough sci-fi, you say, well, wait, Space Force, are we going to defend the Earth from asteroids coming in? Some people think it should be that. So it's the old adage in Washington, where you stand depends on where you sit.
Still, the announcement coming at a specific time. Why now?
President Trump has an interest in space, and he was at a conference. I was actually at the White House down the street last week, and he made a point of saying, well, by the way, we're going to have a Space Force. And everybody in the room was nodding, saying, okay, we're going to have a Space Force, and that was it. We haven't got all the details yet.
So we're waiting for those details, but previous administrations backed away somewhat from space exploration. That opened the door for the private sector. So do you think Trump's push in that direction will reverse that, or does it actually enhance it?
Well, there's two different things, but they overlap. I mean, the commercial space sector is launching more and more military satellites, but the commercial space sector is also launching more of their own satellites, and soon people. And the previous administration, the Obama folks, were pushing commercial space, but the Republicans in the House were against it, which is kind of weird because normally the Republicans would be for commercial space. Well, now it's sort of the polarities reversed, and now you have this administration pushing commercial space, and there's a broader consensus. So there's a bit of a pendulum that goes back and forth and all this stuff, but it seems to be right now that the interest in space in general, whether it be commercial space, civilian space, or military space, all seems to be moving in the same direction. So that's different.
Donald Trump's words are heard around the world, but they're often said for domestic consumption. But this one, when you're talking about space, was that language intended for an international audience? How should the rest of the world, specifically some countries, be hearing this?
Well, I can't get inside of his head. I do think to a certain extent it sounds cool, Space Force. But it does, if you have to listen to some of the other things that he's said, and he's talked about America exerting leadership in space again and moving out there and so forth. So it's part of a broader sort of theme that he's been following. As far as the rest of the world, in some ways we're probably catching up to them because there's a lot of countries, China, India, Japan, and so forth, that already have figured out that they want to be in space, and they want to be the leaders too. So that's interesting. Everybody wants to be the leader, and nobody wants to be the follower.
A sixth military force, the money will have to come from somewhere. I know we don't have a lot of details. Where will it come from?
That's the big question, and even if you said tomorrow, and Congress, of course, hasn't been asked exactly what they want to do, but if Congress went and voted on this, it would probably take 6 to 8 years and cost a lot of money, and you'd have to hire people. And again, the question really is, should we not be focusing what we're already doing in space in terms of military assets, or should we just be distracted by creating a new office over the Pentagon and new uniforms and things like that?
Do you think, Keith, this will re-excite the kids at home when they hear Space Force?
I think they're already excited, and I think they always have been excited about space. I think, like I said before, there is a broad sort of interest in all aspects of space that's starting to bubble up again at NASA, and I think that's already gotten kids' attention. So whether it's Space Force or space exploration or Earth science from space, it's all space and it's all good.
I don't know if we can sign you up for it, but I'll check with you next time.
I'd go tomorrow, yes.
Thank you for joining us. Keith Cowan, editor of NASAWatch.com. Argentina, the last World Cup runners-up, could move on or get kicked out. Check in on the action next. A delegation from Eritrea has arrived in Ethiopia for peace talks for the first time in 20 years. The breakthrough came earlier this month when Ethiopia's new Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed announced he was withdrawing troops from the disputed border region around Badme. He said his country would finally accept Algiers' agreement reached 18 years ago that gave Eritrea control of the area. It's been one of Africa's longest-running conflict. It's claimed tens of thousands of lives. Tuesday's talks looked at how to implement the deal. Voters in Mexico will head to the polls on Sunday to choose their next president. The Institutional Revolutionary Party, or PRI, is currently in power. It's been the kingmaker in Mexican politics for over 70 years, and its candidate may not win. CGTN's Frank Contreras looks back at Mexico's oldest and most powerful political party as part of our special series, Rediscovering the New World.
To understand political power in Mexico, it's essential to know the history of the Institutional Revolutionary Party.
Both France and Denmark have advanced to the World Cup's next round. That's despite a slow-paced draw. It's the first 0-0 tie of this year's tournament. In the other early match, Peru knocked out Australia 2-0. But despite that win, Peru will also not move on. Croatia advances to the round of 16 no matter what. It's playing Iceland right now. Score there, Croatia up 1-0. There's only one qualifying spot left, so Iceland needs to win. So does the winner of Argentina and Nigeria. Argentina currently being held to a 1-1 draw. The Messi-led squad is enduring its longest winless streak in World Cup history. And that is it for The World Today. I'm Roee Ruttenberg. Dialogue is next. We'll be back with more news at the top of the hour. We'll have details for you about that shooting in Hong Kong. Thank you so much for joining us. Please stay tuned.